Clarity by Dragonson, Chapter 15 Mask. Ruby's hands moved into a wheel-like motion as she committed to the next step of the kata. Her foot slid over the earth, careful not to disturb the flowers. It had been a month since she had returned to Beacon, a month since she had left the world of the forest behind. Since then, this had becoming a morning ritual for her. Since returning, sometimes at night, as well, depending on how her day went. She had done the kata so much she didn't even have to think about the movement anymore, although with a quick pivot of her foot she spun into a roundhouse kick. Stomping onto the ground, the girl sent out a quick jab before slowing back into the kata's original pace. The grin on her face was massive. She added in a few tweaks for the fun of it. A few minutes later she came to a complete stop, indicating the end of the kata. I wonder if I can get him to show me the other ones, she mentally mused. Probably not, if she was being honest. The only reason she probably saw this one was because it was for beginners. Nothing that could ultimately compromise him and the rest. Him? Wow, she really didn't have any other way to reference him. I still can't believe he still didn't tell me his name. Well, actually, she could believe it, but still, it was just rude. Cheeks still puffed out, the silver-eyed girl picked up her scroll to check the time, 6:31 a.m. She still had a good 30 minutes before anyone else in her room woke up. That meant she had first dibs on the shower. Score. No regrets today. Clarity. She had regrets. Ruby weaved it to the side as Pyra jabbed forward with her javelin. Repositing, the Scarlet Reaper swung Crescent Rose around for a counter, but the Invincible Girl was able to block with her shield. Moving into a spin, Pyra delivered a roundhouse kick into her opponent's abdomen, the impact causing the younger girl to see stars, amongst which played the flashbacks to her early fights with her sister. Pyra went in for a follow-up, but Ruby felt she didn't need a repeat lesson and shot off a blast from her rifle which sent her backwards, allowing some distance to get between her and the red-headed Amazon. Although she could already tell from the look Pyra was giving her, the intensity of the champion's gaze was making her feel like a mouse in the eyes of a cat. Her reprieve wouldn't last long. Unlike the crowd watching them, who were restively shifting in their seats or checking their phones, the second year teams were more courteous and curious than the first years, and the fighters' own teams, along with a few others, because of Coco's, watched on with mild intrigue, as if the outcome wasn't already decided. It wasn't too surprising, considering the lineup. In a different situation, they would have all loved to see what Ruby could do. She was the girl that went toe to toe with them the most after all. The problem was her opponent. Not to say either party was really at fault, it was just more of a shared unshakable fact. No one beat Pyro. Ruby watched Pyra charge at her with weapon shifted into sword form, which she had somehow missed, knowing that no matter what she did, Pyra would react faster and win. An ironic scenario for Ruby considering her semblance, just like in the forest. Ruby's eyes popped open as the memory came back to her as forcefully as her opponent's kick. It had worked then. She had been weaponless at the time, but maybe, no, it could still work here. Maybe. Only one way to find out, the girl noted as she narrowed her silver stare on the goal. So as the invincible girl approached, she did something that no one expected, something that would seem impossible for someone who had been exposed to her for more than a few seconds. She dropped her scythe. The looks of boredom were instantly erased, unorthodox in any situation, but for a weapon nut like Ruby to willingly discard an object she was frequently caught talking to as if it were her own flesh and blood, well, that was ridiculous, beyond ridiculous, so much so that not even the ever stern good witch could keep the look of surprise off her face. Pyra being the one most focused on Ruby with the girl's nuanced habits and fighting style overrailed on her mind's eye like a heads-up display, was the most surprised at this patriotism shift. Her eyebrows shot up behind her brass area like a bow of a violin string, and the whole performance nearly came to a screeching halt. The key word being nearly. quick push out the ring. Power's more pragmatic side quickly took over, preparing to end the match. With the boost from her aura, the invincible girl thrust her weapon forward and straight at the younger girl's developing chest, or at least she would have if Ruby had not been ready, but clearly unpracticed. It would have been almost comical in any other situation, just how slow and awkward Ruby was when she dodged the attack without crescent rows to counterbalance her. Para tracked the girl's movements frame by frame, but was unable to stop her from reaching out to grab her arm. Ruby placed herself like he had, and suddenly Para was the one unbalanced, practically being launched off the smaller girl's lower center of mass and hitting the ground with a resounding smack, like a slap in the face. In a snap action, Ruby kicked her dropped weapon back into her hands and placed herself atop Paro, the barrel of her rifle staring point blank down at the pea of Juniper so that she would have no time to counterattack. For added effect, Ruby racked the bolt, making it clear that there was nothing standing between the redhead and the large caliber aura-piercing round but her twitching trigger finger. The expression, so quiet one could hear a pin drop, wasn't quite correct in this situation. It was the clatter as someone dropped a pencil, which would have sounded like a tree falling if there was anyone paying attention. It was the sound of one hand clapping at the impossible performance. It was something which just didn't happen. That's the match. Goodwich blinked, stuttered, another sign surely that they were in a different reality. But with that, it was official. For the first time ever, Para had tasted defeat. Then they went wild. Once the door was open into this brave new world, the spectators stampeded through all at once. Whoops and whistles could be heard from every direction and outstanding sight. That was an excellent match, Ruby. Para complimented as she picked herself off the ground, more bemused than bruised. I think I may have found myself a rival. Rivals with the invisible girl. Oh, help her. If she was not going to squeal, she was not going to squeal. I have to say, that was a rather interesting move you used, the Amazon spoke, still trying to wrap her own mind around what had happened. Where did you learn it from? Oh, I was so glad you asked. I got the idea from a guy who was trying to kill me at the time, Ruby thought. Of course she couldn't say that out loud. Just something I saw in an anime once. She shrugged, not looking her rival squeal in the eyes. Looked cool, so I thought I'd try it. Only you would use something you saw in a child's cartoon. The two fighters turned to see the respective teams approaching them. It's just the girl that tried to work out in an anime because it made the character's chest bigger, Yang countered. I did no such thing, Weast hissed, red flooding her face. Yes, you did, Blake added, feigning disinterest from behind her book. Stay out of this! Ruby couldn't help laugh at the conversation, finally finding a little bit of relief out of all this change. Clarity. Do you think they have any tattoos? You mean like a signature to recognize them? They're assassins. I thought they broadcast themselves in such a way. My dad told me how they fought with one once. I hear they never use guns. Too loud. I doubt buying a similar mask will let you go undercover. All around her conversations were being held about speculations about them, about him. Nothing that surprising if what the end of it. But much like everything else in Ruby's life, it was never that simple. One such being, all the pictures in the target practice were now in the shape of animal masks, cartoonish parodies of the assassins' calling cards, which soon indoctrinated students had disturbed using the printer in the teacher's lounge. Did that mean they approved of this? The most frequent target use was clearly based off Kitsune. Not only that, but Ruby noticed that there were more students in the library now during their study sessions. All the whispers over the shoulders made it difficult to concentrate on their team's board game anyway. Researching not just the factual information on the assassins, but straying into the myth and lore surrounding foxes, especially ways to hunt and restrain them. Overnight, it seemed foxes had become the most hated animals at the school, even by other faunesses. From what she could see, as the only face associated with the assassin's name, he had become their avatar. The character depicting of the so-called devil in the old books, which everyone used to laugh at, Coincidentally, one of Coco's teammates' actual name was Fox, no relation, and Ruby so overheard her jokingly suggesting he change his name. Speaking of Coco, the older girl had basically taken Ruby under her wing. Actually, it was more like she shanghaied the younger student, abducting the girl at random times to train as her apprentice. Ruby had initially wanted to protest, but the empathetic slash apologetic look Velvet had given her told her it was futile. She had been right. It wasn't all bad though. Coco really was a cool person and definitely came off as the cool older sister type, as long as one ignored her arrogance and zero tolerance antagonistic stance towards the assassins. Plus, she had been giving her a lot of tips on leadership, Coco being a captain herself, which Ruby had appreciated immensely. All in all, it wasn't so bad. You're sitting with me today, Gothic Lolita, except when she came strutting in like she was on a catwalk and everyone else was either forced to join in or sit down, shut up, and appreciate the show. It seemed John was one such victim. Still wasn't clear if he was a participant or part of the audience. This was how Ruby found herself sitting at a table next to her fellow first year leader with Coco sitting across from them. Why am I here? John asked. Because I want you here, Mr. Paladin. That's nice and all, but hush now. Yes, ma'am. He didn't stand a chance. Better people had tried. Ruby patted the sulking boy on the arm in reassurance. At least she didn't prop you up in front of the entire school, she muttered. What was that, strawberry shortcake? Nothing! Ruby squeaked, going rigid. She did not want to earn Coco's ire next, least she risked the diva going through her closet, and she already had one older girl overlooking her fashion sense. She didn't need another, especially one who treated clothes as seriously as a church. Coco smirked at the young captain as she rested her head in one of her hands. So how's the Leadership 101 going for you little munchkins? The girl questioned. Pretty good, John answered, although admittedly I'm not looking forward to midterms next week. How do you think I feel? Reuben nodded. At least you didn't miss 2 whole weeks. Those were extreme circumstances, John countered. I'm sure the guy will understand. Maybe. It should be a fairly easy one, Coco reassured. It's probably be something along the lines of a team assessment for their individual strengths and weaknesses and how to make use of the former and counter the latter. Well, that shouldn't be too hard, Ruby perked up. Don't get your hopes up, Munchkin, Coco stated. There's no guarantee, but usually he does sometimes allow along those lines, since you've had missed 6 months to get to know your individual teams. Well, I don't know how good I would do there, John groaned. I mean, my biggest problem with Nora would be her over eagerness to charge in for a fight, although her absorbing lightning makes her perfect as a tank since she has nearly boundless stamina to top it all off. The blonde noted. The exact opposite of Ren, who has low stamina, which puts him at a disadvantage, although since he has the best aura control in our grade, that makes up for it. Plus, with his semblance, he's perfect to hit and runs based tactics. Para can pretty much do what she wants since her weapon puts her as an all around fighter, and that's not to mention her skills. Although I put her at close range before anything. The younger leader sighed. Oh man, I don't think I'm going to do well on the midterms if it's that. Coco and Ruby shared a look before staring back at the blonde. Was this guy serious? Okay then, Coco said slowly. What about you, Red? Any thoughts on your team? That's a bit difficult, Ruby admitted with a sigh. Well, don't twist it so much, Coco encouraged. No team starts out perfect. You're putting 4 teenagers with different personalities together. Doesn't help that you're all girls. John nodded with an agreement, being witness to such a thing living with 7 sisters. What's helping is finding some common ground. John nodded in agreement once again as tears streamed down his face. His sisters had all found common ground in using him as a dummy for dresses and other horrors he would never forget. Which, for your team, I assume, isn't that difficult, she added with a knowing look at Ruby, instantly understanding. The assassins. Her team had the most confrontation with them so far. It was the one group that we detested more than the White Fang. It was also the reason her team had actually started acting like a team. specifically the incident that took place in Vale. Ironic considering that was the day Ruby took her team out to get to know each other. But even with that, there's still issues that needed to be hashed out, issues that Ruby couldn't help but feel were gonna make themselves known sooner than later. One day I'll tell you about the early days for my team to give you some perspective. Can we not? The three leaders turned to see the remaining members of Team Coffee arriving at the table with their food trays in hand. Coco, please tell me you didn't kidnap Ruby again. Kidnap is a strong word, Coco shrugged. I say I picked her up. Like you did Velvet when you took her shopping, yeah, Tushi noted. Hey, I just wanted to emphasize her figure and her adorable bunny ears. The Sea of Coffee defended. She needs to strut her stuff. You could have at least heard her out, Fox suggested. You all do realize I'm right here, right? Velvet said, taking a seat next to Ruby. Don't make me go through your wardrobe, Coco threatened, ignoring the other girl on her team. Yeah, I'm sure that'll have so much effect on me, the dark-skinned teen countered, emphasizing his blind eyes. He's got you there, Velvet chuckled. I'm sorry, it sounds like someone wants another shopping spree. What are you gonna emphasize this time? You already did my ears. Be lucky you weren't born with a bunny tail instead, Coco countered. Oh, the fun I would have had with your wardrobe. Coco, please, Velvet begged. I bet it would have been fluffy too, the fashionista moaned. Coco! The beret-wearing girl laughed at her teammates' ire along with their other teammates, while Ruby and John watched on. They're all older teams. Were all older teams this crazy, or maybe it was just Team Coffee. At least their own teams weren't this bad. At this though, their mind shifted to their own teams: an heiress, an antisocial class pervert, and her older sister, an invincible Amazon, a monk, and Nora. Dot 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 dot. Okay, maybe all teams were this crazy. Deciding not to dwell on it, the two first years silently got up to escape the craziness as well as head to the next class since lunch was just about over. Goku would probably make them pay for it later, but they had until after the break to worry about it. Midterms were going to keep them busy, and right after midterms was the break. Who knows, maybe she would forget them ditching without saying a word. Dot dot dot. Dot dot dot. John, I'm not gonna hurry on to class, Ruby said, hoping the older girl hadn't seen them yet. Sure thing, John shrugged as he placed his tray onto the counter. With a quick wave, Ruby hurried on off as her mind wandered off into other areas. I wonder if his tail is fluffy. The thought cropped up to Ruby later as she made her way out of the cafeteria. John watched as Ruby hastily scurried away like a paranoid squirrel, though thought everyone was out for her nuts. In reality, she probably was nuts, but everyone wanted a piece of her anyway. It had been about a month since she had been retrieved from the forest, and things returned to normal. And in all that time, John had determined one thing: Ruby was hiding something. He didn't know what it was, but something was different about his friend. It would have been easy to catch up to trauma, reasonable considering she had been stranded alone in a forest with a killer for 2 weeks, but there were times where she would stare out into space like she had just now. Now is this was again a normal thing for her, but John knew all of her space off faces. Her I'm craving something sweet like 50 chocolate chip cookies face, usually accompanied by a strand of drool. Her how would I make this weapon idea work face, drool may or may not apply, and her panicked face from when she had forgotten her schoolwork in some fashion and was desperately trying and failing to pretend like she hadn't. Not to mention the face she made after secretly reading one of Blake's filthy books. Her skin turned so red it was difficult to tell if she had her hood up or down, and occasional drool with a glint in her eyes at John did not like. But the look she had just made was a new one that hadn't appeared until after the incident, and this wasn't the only thing he noticed. On more than one occasion he had caught Ruby staring out of the window into the emerald forest. To John, one forest looked the same as any other, and he couldn't really understand how someone could tell the difference, let alone stare at one for hours on end trying. Then again, that was probably why he frequently got lost. When Ruby's eyes glazed over for so long they took on a green tinge, it was clear to him that she too was lost, although it was almost as if she wanted to get lost, like she wanted to go back to that forest, like there was something there that she had left, or maybe, no, that can't be it. The leader of Juniper dismissed the thought before it fully formed, wanting to slap himself for ever considering it. What can't be it? John recognized the voice as someone who would gladly slap him if asked. The lead Cardin looked at John like he was now when the boy turned around with indifference. Speaking of people acting different, nothing really. John blew off quickly. Just because he was no longer a bully, his former victim didn't feel comfortable sharing his thoughts. Then again, he didn't feel comfortable with anything if Cardin got involved. Best to keep his thoughts to himself. Besides, he doubted the ginger boy would be able to appreciate what he was thinking. Were you talking about how the shrimp's acting differently? John could do nothing to hide his surprise at his response. Maybe the joke was more astute than he let on. In some cruel way, Cardin's bullying could be considered scientific experimentation. I don't like how surprised your face is at my response. What? No, I was thinking you were an idiot. I didn't say you were, Cardin growled, old animosity returning. Oh, could be trauma, he suggested, eventually directing his anger glare in a safe direction like it was a loaded weapon. Probably was. Maybe, John agreed, but what was happening right now? Are you going to confront her? No. Thinking about this for longer than he dared consider his and Cardin's amicable relations, John decided both were better left alone. So far, it doesn't seem to be a problem, so I'll leave it alone for now. And if it does become a problem, then I'll take action. And he would. Ruby had been his first friend here, and the one he could relate to the most, both being outcasts in their own way. She had been there whenever he had needed someone, and sometimes when he thought he didn't need anyone. So he would be there for her when she needed, even if she wouldn't know it at the time. Smart. Carden smirked more in approval than condensation. Now let's head to class. Right. John nodded, discreetly, still trying to wrap his head around the previous conversation along with the next words. See you, Carden. He gave his former adversary a wave, only to receive a blank stare which made him think that things hadn't changed that much. You do realize that we both have the same class next, right? Right. John sighed. He had forgotten entirely. No, things had not changed. Clarity. Ninja toe, Ruby read out loud. A straight blade approximately equal to the length of the user's forearm, generally depicted as having a straight edge with a square guard. She continued reading. Typically used for swift and slash or stealth attacks. Yeah, that sounded about right. He seemed to like using those trench knives more than the sword. Ruby mused, Silver Eye scanning the rest of the page and index for anything that resembled the Faunus's preferred weapons. Maybe he's more comfortable with hand-to-hand. It wouldn't surprise her from what she could see, despite their adherence to uniformity. Assassins did have the capability for individualism in fighting styles. One of his teammates used the katana instead of the ninjato, and another one had straight up punched her. Correction, two of them had punched her, just that the first was as strong as her sister and therefore difficult to forget. Was it weird that she wanted to know more about someone who was trying to kill her? Dot dot dot. Slowly, Ruby opened one of the desk drawers and reached inside. A moment later, she produced the mask of her former enemy and companion. What would you call that anyway? Animanian? Companion? These were the serious questions. Whoever had painted this had been going for intimidation. In Ruby's opinion, they had succeeded. Even now, as she held it in her hands, she couldn't help but feel like it was alive, yet not very much like a Grim. The only relief that told her it wouldn't jump out and bite her was the barely visible crack, which she knew was there, and perhaps only because she knew it was there. Then there were the red marks incised in either side, something she hadn't appreciated until she traced her fingers and felt the subtle change, like scar tissue. As someone who pawned over weapons, she could appreciate the attention to detail and decided that emulating the boy's facial marks was somehow significant. Unhingedly, she ran her fingers over the rest of it, feeling the defects as if she were a blind person trying to understand who she was looking at. Maybe she should paint the cracks red so she could see them as easily as feeling them. Some cultures highlighted the defects, celebrating them as signs of genuineness. Flipping the mask over, she observed the inner wall, which was rough and clearly hand-stippled. She could almost see his thumbprints, her own mimicking the movements of smoothing out the lacquer. So this was what it looked like before he put it on, before he went out to... What does the world look like to you behind this? Ruby whispered, still half expecting the mask to answer. And the longer she stared at it, the closer it got, slowly but surely enveloping her face in darkness. What did he see? Of course, that was the moment one of her teammates decided to return. The leader of Ruby had never moved so fast without her semblance in her life, dropping the mask on the table and diving onto her bed. So this is where you are, Blake greeted, not noticing the mask, which rattled like a castanet on her captain's table. Yep, Ruby squeaked, still reeling from almost being caught. Not that she was necessarily doing anything wrong, but still, just looking through some leadership guides, yeah, that's the one she would go with. They couldn't check her for that since they didn't have the class. Don't let Weiss hear you say that. A whistle signaled her sister's arrival, Weiss trailing in as the caboose. Great, now all of them were here. It was good as a distraction, but the mask was still out for the world to see. Are you trying to earn my ire, Xiaolong? Ruby's partner was too easy to rile up, and she knew it. Declining confrontation, she distracted herself by looking over the rest of the room, and Weiss, being Weiss, was the first to notice anything out of place, and thus the first to key in on Ruby's guilty secret. This thing! Weiss hissed like a cobra, and her other teammates immediately reacted, catching on to what she was looking at in the next second, and added similar poisonous looks. Never had Ruby thought that being in her with her team would feel like a room full of vipers. Maybe I should just break it and be done with it, Yang growled, baring her fangs as she moved forward, eyes beginning to go red. No! Ruby yelled, casting off the illusion of relaxation like sheets, and leaping out of bed. Not caring about appearances anymore, she threw herself between Yang and the mask. So thrown by her younger sister's actions, Yang's semblance deactivated as if tripping a circuit breaker. She wasn't the only one, as the others were equally stiffened by the captain's behavior. What? Weiss was the first to recover, so scandalized by her partner's plea. Why not let her get rid of it? I don't want to get destroyed, Ruby began, having anticipated this confrontation, but hardly prepared for it. I want to keep it. What? Yang bellowed, flames bursting from her body. This was the part Ruby wasn't looking forward to. Are you are you out of your mind? No, Ruby waved off frantically, like she was just denying she'd forgotten her homework again. I have my reasons, the girl finished meekly. Like what? We interrogated, barely through the clouds of steam that created when Yang's flames met the Shnee's aura. Well, whatever defense Ruby could conjure in the next few seconds couldn't stand up to Yang's scorched earth policy. Well, you can forget it, with an expression that was perhaps as hostile as the mask itself. Yang moved towards it. There's no way I'm letting you keep that. Ruby's panic was put on pause as she replayed this one in her head. The image of a delicate rose fell away like petals, leaving only a prickliness that her team hardly knew existed. Let me, she scowled. The taste, the phrase, like all the healthy food people said were good for her. What do you mean, let me? Exactly what I said. Last I checked, you weren't my keeper. Ruby snapped, stood up, and revealed herself not to be a Russell Terrier, but a Doberman that had only been resting on its laurels and was only being held back by a flimsy collar. Back home, Yang's temper was legendary, from boy toys to teachers who disagreed with her. Even vendors who she felt hadn't adhered well enough to the principle of the customer always being right. Few people could stand up to Yang during one of her rampages. Ruby was an exception. "I'm the older sister," Yang argued. "I'm the team leader," Ruby countered with as much force as her sister. "Doesn't mean my job has changed. This isn't Patch," Ruby sneered. "I can take care of myself." "Why keep it?" Blake interjected, trying to bring in some logic as a buffer to the impending crash. "Why keep the mask of the man who tried to kill you?" Hers was the only argument which said that she actually wanted to know instead of forcing her own viewpoint. Seeing this truth, Ruby took in a few measured breaths, slowly calming herself down. Finally, when she thought her head was clear enough, Ruby blinked away the looming fog of war and looked around the room at her team's varying expressions. She turned around and slowly picked up the mask, having asked herself the same question. Well, when I was out there, trying to recall it with so many people was difficult, but she had to answer honestly. I was left alone with my thoughts for hours on end. Not an actual lie, since whenever the blonde hunted, he would be gone for hours, and even when he was around, it was often like she was alone because he was so reluctant to talk. I couldn't help but wonder if he would comfort me in my sleep. I tried not to, but I had to ask myself if I was going to die out there. But when I saw the mask, as a reminder, she answered, a reminder that he's still out there, and that more than likely I will see him again, and as a reminder of what could happen when the time comes. The others nodded, understanding at her words, which they couldn't. They could only appreciate the auxiliary feelings of helplessness, not knowing if their leader was alive or dead. They had worried too, picturing all the horrible fates which could have befallen her, but they were incapable of imagining what it was actually like to be in that situation, and her team would make sure that no one ever would again. They would banish the assassin's memories from Remnant so that an object like that mask no longer held power. They would destroy the myth, prove that assassins, like Grimm, were not but mortals. Clarity. Minutes, maybe even hours passed by as Ruby laid in bed, unable to sleep. The lights snoring of her team was the only thing telling her she was not alone in the darkness, and yet it didn't help as comforting as it should have. Her mind was unable to rest as it replayed the day's events, projecting on the blank screen all around her the fight with Pyra, Coco's lecture, and finally the argument with her team. Admittedly, a productive day, but really stressful. A batch of cookies would make it a whole lot better. Eating late at night can lead to sleep deprivation and several other health hazards, which would make you an easy target to be taken out. Even when he was helpful, he couldn't help but do so with a nod to the morbid. Ruby herself couldn't help but find it mildly funny, chuckling quietly to herself as she recounted one of their many awkward dinner conversations. Ruby reached under her blanket, grabbing hold of the object of her team's contention and taking it out. Even this late, even in a room almost totally devoid of light, it still seemed like a bottomless well, moonlight barely visible somewhere far up above, and she held it aloft. Bringing it out recalled the conversation she had with her team about her reasons for keeping the mask. They might have accepted her reasons, if not her feelings, but there had also been a tacit agreement shared between the three of them, no doubt making a promise to rectify the wrong that had been done to her, to keep her safe from then on. But they didn't understand how Ruby felt on the matter. Ruby herself wouldn't pretend to know all the intricacies of her own emotions, for which she'd had to invent several stopgap words until she could pin down exactly what she was feeling. However, there were broader implications, so these indications and those were not lost on Ruby. Now, Ruby wasn't a scientist, but she knew that the one incident didn't prove a theory, even if that one incident was for the duration of a couple weeks. A week was nothing. Heck, she forgot most of her past homework assignments in a week, so she would wait for another chance. Ruby took one last look at the black mask before placing it under her pillow, where hopefully nobody would snoop around for it. She pulled the blanket over herself and rested her head down, noticing the lump but not minding. In fact, shouldn't she feel some kind of discomfort in the totem of a man who had tried to kill her? And wasn't it strange that she felt relaxed after committing a set of movements that were probably used to kill people? And what about her obsession with weapons? What did that mean? These were things to think about. I wonder if he ever looks at it like I do. This was a far more relaxing mystery, and for just a moment she could pretend that he did, picturing a drop of emotion entering his eyes like the Sandman's dust and falling asleep. Clarity. Naruto, you in here? Sakura questioned as she opened the door to his room. Sure enough, the blonde was there looking over the contents of a book she couldn't make out from the angle. Naruto looked up with a blank stare, making eye contact with his teammate. What is it, Sakura? And at his words, the pinkhead smiled. She would never get tired of that. We've been summoned for a debriefing, she answered, focusing back on the original reason she was there. I will be there shortly. The whiskered teen nodded. Sakura nodded and shut the door, deciding to wait for him. From outside the door she could hear shuffling as the blonde moved around, doing who knows what. A moment later the door opened and Naruto stepped out. You wait for me, Naruto said. I don't want to walk alone. Sakura shrugged with a smile. I see, the blonde whiskered teen stated as the two began to walk away. What were you doing in there anyway? She questioned, looking up at her captain. Just putting some items away, he answered. Sakura hummed in understanding before moving on with the conversation to other topics. Back in the room, the rose emblem shimmered under the moonlight. End of chapter 15.